It started as a normal evening, just like any other. But by the end of the night, nothing would ever be the same again. We had always been close, more like companions than anything else. I could always count on him, and he on me. But that night, after everything we'd shared, things changed in a way I could never have imagined. And neither of us saw it coming. What began with a simple request to help in the kitchen turned into something neither of us were prepared for. We had always been so comfortable around each other, so in sync. But that evening, there was something in the air. Something unspoken. Something that would lead to more than either of us ever expected. But what happened that night was only the beginning. And the truth of what unfolded between us would stay hidden for much longer than we ever thought possible. Our relationship was built on trust. From the start, he was always there when I needed him, and I did the same for him. It wasn't always easy, but we made it work. He was never just a stepson to me, he was someone I relied on, someone I cared for deeply. Over time, we became closer, more than I ever thought we could be. It wasn't something that happened overnight, it grew slowly, almost imperceptibly. But once I started to notice, it was like everything shifted. We spent so many quiet evenings together, helping around the house, or just chatting over a cup of tea. Simple, innocent moments that should have been nothing more than that. But somewhere along the way, something began to change. The conversations lingered longer, the smiles held more meaning, and the way we looked at each other, there was an unspoken understanding. I didn't want to admit it at first, but those little moments, those seemingly innocent exchanges, felt different. They didn't feel like they should. And yet, every time I pushed it away, something drew me back in, as if the connection between us was growing stronger than I could ignore. It started like any other evening. He offered to help me prepare dinner. A gesture I'd grown used to and appreciated more than I let on. It was one of those small habits that made our bond feel natural, almost effortless. But that evening, something was different, something I couldn't quite name. His voice was calm and steady as he asked, "What's on the menu tonight?" I laughed softly, teasing him about his terrible chopping skills, and he smiled, his eyes holding mine a fraction longer than usual. That look, it was subtle, but it stayed with me as we began working side by side. Everything felt routine, yet charged in a way I couldn't ignore. I handed him the vegetables to chop, and for the first time, I noticed the way his hands moved, precise and deliberate, like he wanted to get it right this time. His laughter filled the space between us when he joked about how helping in the kitchen should earn him a medal. I smiled, but beneath the laughter, there was an undercurrent, a quiet tension I couldn't shake. We moved around the kitchen in sync, something we'd done 100 times before. But that night, every movement felt different. When he reached past me to grab a spice jar, his arm brushed against mine. It was such a small gesture, one that shouldn't have meant anything, but the warmth of his touch lingered longer than it should have. I felt my breath hitch, just for a moment, and wondered if he noticed. The conversation flowed as easily as ever, but this time every word seemed to carry a weight I couldn't quite understand. He shared a funny story about his day, and I found myself laughing harder than I usually would, hanging on to every word like it mattered more than it should. There was an energy between us, subtle but undeniable, that seemed to weave itself into every glance, every word, and every moment we shared that evening. As we set the table and sat down to eat, the mood felt lighter, yet the tension in the air remained, just beneath the surface. He casually mentioned, after this, we should just relax. Maybe Netflix and chill for a bit, or I could give you one of those massages you love. His tone was easy, almost playful, but there was something about the way he said it that made me pause. For a split second, I wondered if he meant more, but I quickly pushed the thought away. We finished dinner, the conversation flowing like usual, but my mind kept drifting back to that moment. Why had his words stayed with me? Was I imagining the change in his tone, or was there something real behind it? I tried to focus on the meal, on the familiar comfort of our routine, but I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced every time he looked at me. After dinner, we moved to the living room, settling into our usual spots on the couch. The soft hum of the television filled the space, but neither of us was really paying attention. The day had been long, and I could feel the heaviness of it pressing down on my shoulders, the kind of weight that no amount of sitting still seemed to ease. He must have noticed because, after a moment, he turned to me, his voice warm and familiar. "You look exhausted," he said, his tone laced with concern. "How about I give you a massage? You'll feel better." It wasn't an unusual suggestion. Over time, we developed this comfortable rhythm, and he'd offered before, always in a kind and considerate way. I smiled softly, nodding as I leaned forward slightly, already anticipating the relief his hands would bring. He shifted closer, his movements unhurried, almost cautious, as if waiting for some invisible signal to begin. His hands settled on my shoulders, warm and steady, and as they began to knead away the tension, I couldn't help but let out a small sigh of relief. The weight I'd been carrying all day began to lift, little by little, with each careful press of his fingers. But tonight, something was different. There was a tenderness in his touch, a care that felt deeper than before. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it in the way his fingers lingered just a moment longer. The way his movements slowed, as if savoring every second. For a while, we didn't speak. The room was filled with nothing but the soft murmur of the TV and the rhythm of his hands working over my shoulders. I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the sensation, letting go of the tension in my body and the thoughts swirling in my mind. But as his hands moved with deliberate care, I couldn't ignore the way my heart began to race. "Do you want to feel even better?" he asked quietly, his voice low and steady. The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I'd heard him correctly. My heart skipped a beat, and my breathing quickened, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I nodded, almost without thinking, as if some part of me had already decided. His hands moved more slowly now, his touch more deliberate. It wasn't just a massage anymore, it was something else, something deeper, more intimate. I felt the warmth of his hands, the care in every movement, and I realized I didn't want it to stop. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel what I had been denying for so long. I didn't open my eyes, but I could feel him hesitate for a moment, as if waiting for me to say something. But I didn't need to. My silence was an answer in itself, and when his hands gently traced down my arms, I knew we had crossed a line. Yet, in that moment, it didn't feel wrong. It felt inevitable, like we had both been moving toward this without even realizing it. There was no rush, no urgency. Everything about it was slow, deliberate, and filled with a kind of care that I hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time, I let myself stop pretending. I let myself feel. And as the warmth between us grew, I knew this wasn't just about easing my tension, it was something far deeper, something that neither of us could take back. What happened next was unplanned but mutual. As his hands moved over my shoulders and down my arms, there was a tenderness in his touch that sent a warmth through me, one I couldn't ignore. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned closer, his breath soft against my ear as he asked, almost in a whisper, "Is this okay?" My heart raced, and though I didn't speak, the slight nod of my head was all the answer he needed. The space between us disappeared as his hands moved with care, drawing me in further with every gentle touch. My skin tingled under his fingertips, a sensation that seemed to awaken something within me that I had long kept buried. Piece by piece, the barriers we had both held onto slipped away. The fabric of my clothes dropped lightly to the floor, each moment feeling deliberate, unhurried, and filled with an undeniable sweetness that he didn't rush, and neither did I. Every motion, every glance, was infused with an intensity that felt almost surreal. The warmth of his body against mine brought a sense of connection that was both overwhelming and comforting. His movements were slow, purposeful, as though he was savoring every second, and I found myself mirroring him, letting the moment guide us both. That it wasn't just physical, it was emotional, as though every touch was a silent acknowledgement of something we'd both known but never spoken aloud. The way he held me, the way his hands moved over my skin, and the quiet intimacy of it all felt like an unspoken promise, a moment neither of us would ever forget. As we lay intertwined, feeling the closeness and warmth between us, I couldn't help but close my eyes and let myself get lost in the sweetness of it all. For those moments, nothing else mattered. It was just us, together, sharing something we hadn't planned but couldn't deny. What do you think about this real-life experience? Have you ever witnessed or heard of moments like this that completely changed someone's relationship? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. If this true story resonated with you, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more compelling real-life tales. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you'll be the first to see the next story. And if you have a true story you'd like to share, let me know. I might just feature it in an upcoming video. Thank you for watching, and I hope this true story resonated with you. Remember, every story has its own lesson, its own perspective. Until next time, take care of yourselves and cherish the connections that matter most.